Deep in the heart of the Yukon Territory, where the winters are ruthless and the land keeps its secrets buried beneath layers of permafrost and stone, one man refused to give up. Rick Ness, a name that had once represented relentless determination and raw mining instinct, had spent the last 2 seasons watching everything he built slowly crumble around him. Nearly $12 million had slipped through his fingers like fine gold dust in a windstorm. Machines had broken, crew members had walked away, and the whispers across Yukon mining camps had grown louder with every passing week. People were saying Rick Ness was finished, that the fire that once drove him to dig deeper than anyone else had finally gone cold. But they were wrong, because sometimes the greatest discoveries in history begin exactly at the moment when everyone stops believing. It started with a set of old geological records that Rick stumbled upon during a particularly desperate stretch of the off-season. Tucked inside a weathered filing box at a local surveying office, the documents described a mining operation that had been active sometime in the late 1970s and early 1980s near a remote stretch of the Yukon wilderness. The site had no modern name attached to it, no active claim, no recent survey data, just a series of handwritten notes, faded topographic maps, and a shutdown order dated nearly 4 decades ago. Most people who glanced at those documents would have seen nothing but a failed chapter in mining history. Rick Ness saw something entirely different. He saw possibility. The shutdown notes were vague in the way that only truly alarming things tend to be. References to unstable ground conditions. Warnings about underground pressure fluctuations. A single line that mentioned unexplained metallic density readings at significant depth before the operation was abruptly halted. The official record listed the closure as economically motivated, but the details scattered between those dry administrative lines told a messier and far more interesting story. Something had been found down there. Something that the miners of that era either could not safely reach or chose not to pursue. And whatever it was, it had been sitting untouched ever since, frozen beneath the Yukon ice, waiting. Rick did not make his decision lightly. He sat with those documents for weeks, cross-referencing them with modern geological surveys, consulting with 2 independent earth science experts, and quietly reaching out to a handful of investors who still believed in his instincts despite the losses. The numbers he kept arriving at were staggering. Based on the density readings described in the old records and the geological formation patterns of the surrounding region, the hidden deposit below that forgotten site could conservatively be worth somewhere in the range of $190 million. That figure was almost too large to say out loud. But Rick said it anyway, to his remaining crew, to his backers, and to himself every morning when he looked in the mirror. He committed everything. Remaining personal savings, borrowed capital, and the final reserves of investor funding were pooled together into an operational budget of nearly $6 million. It was an enormous sum by any standard, but against the potential of what lay underground, Rick believed it was justified. Heavy excavation equipment was ordered and transported into the remote location. Deep drilling rigs capable of penetrating well beyond 200 feet were assembled on site. Fuel tankers made delivery runs across rough terrain to keep the operation supplied around the clock. Within weeks, what had been an empty stretch of frozen wilderness was transformed into a fully operational mining camp running 24 hours a day under powerful floodlights that cut through the long Yukon nights. The early days of the operation were brutal. The ground that looked relatively manageable from the surface revealed itself to be something far more complicated beneath. The frozen upper layers gave way to compressed rock formations of unusual density, far harder than the typical placer ground that most Yukon miners were experienced with. Drill bits designed for standard operations were struggling. Within the first 10 days, the main drill head on one of the primary rigs snapped under the pressure, bringing the entire operation to a standstill for several hours while mechanics assessed the damage. The repair bill alone came to nearly $180,000, a painful early blow to the budget. But the breakdowns kept coming. A hydraulic failure on one of the large excavators. A blown pressure motor on a secondary drilling unit. By the end of the second week, the operation had already spent close to $500,000 on equipment repairs alone, and the gold readings near the surface remained frustratingly absent. Tension inside the camp began to build. Some of the more experienced crew members started having quiet conversations among themselves, wondering if the old shutdown records had been right for a reason. The Yukon had swallowed entire fortunes before. Maybe this was simply another mine that looked better on paper than it did in practice. Rick refused to let that thinking take hold. During a late-night meeting in the operations trailer, with the wind hammering against the thin metal walls and the monitors casting blue light across tired faces, he laid it out plainly. The difficulty of reaching something valuable underground does not mean the value is not there. If anything, it means the opposite. Nobody was willing to push hard enough for decades ago, and that is the only reason this deposit is still sitting here waiting for someone with enough conviction to find it. That night, the crew voted to continue. Then the monitors changed everything. On a night that had started like every other night on that frozen site, with machines grinding through the dark and engineers running diagnostics on the latest scan data, something appeared on one of the underground imaging screens that stopped every conversation in the room. A metallic density anomaly. Not subtle. Not ambiguous. A concentrated signature reading nearly 68% above baseline normal ground readings, located at a depth of approximately 140 feet below the surface. The engineer running the scan asked a colleague to verify. The colleague ran an independent check on a separate machine. Same signal. Same location. Same intensity. The war room went completely quiet. Readings like that simply do not occur in ordinary placer gold deposits. When you see a concentration signature of that magnitude at that depth, it does not point to scattered fine gold spread through gravel channels. It points to something dense, something accumulated, something that has been sitting undisturbed long enough to build into a pocket of extraordinary richness. A geological consultant who had been brought in to advise on the deeper scanning work studied the data for a long moment and then said, quietly but clearly, that if those readings were accurate, the team was not looking at a surface scatter. They were looking at a deep concentration event. Rick authorized immediate expanded scanning. Over the following 24 hours, multiple imaging passes were run across the anomaly zone. Each pass returned the same fundamental picture. A concentrated mass of metallic material, positioned within a geological structure that appeared to include hollow cavity formations in the surrounding rock. That second detail was where the situation became both more exciting and more dangerous. Cavities underground mean instability. They mean pressure zones that can shift without warning. They mean that the act of drilling toward the gold could trigger conditions that put lives and equipment at serious risk. Everyone in that war room understood the trade-off being discussed. The first major cleanup run came roughly 1 week after the anomaly was confirmed. After processing several hundred cubic yards of excavated material through the wash plant, the final recovery sequence began. It started slowly, as cleanups always do, with the black sand concentrates being cleared away to reveal what the ground had given up. Then the gold began to appear. Small pieces at first, and then larger ones, nuggets of unusual density and richness that sat heavy on the cleanup table under the harsh work lights. The scale numbers climbed. 100 ounces. 150. 200. The final count settled at 280 ounces of gold recovered from that single run, an amount valued at the time at approximately $850,000. The reaction inside the cleanup room was difficult to describe. Several crew members who had spent years in mining and who had learned long ago to manage their expectations simply stared at the table without speaking. One veteran miner admitted later that he had never seen that level of concentration from that volume of material in his entire career. Something about the character of the gold itself was unusual. Its density, its color, the way the larger pieces sat together on the cleanup table, it did not look like the typical scattered placer deposit that Yukon mining operations usually chase. It looked like something older and more concentrated, like a deep geological event had gathered extraordinary amounts of gold into a single zone over millions of years. News traveled fast across the Yukon. In a territory where mining is not just an industry but a culture and a community, word of an $850,000 single cleanup from a forgotten site spread through camps and fuel stations and equipment yards within days. Skeptics existed, as they always do in places where big claims are common and big disappointments are even more common. But when respected figures within the broader Yukon mining world began examining the publicly available scan data and cleanup numbers and responded not with dismissal but with genuine silence and then genuine acknowledgement, the skepticism began to soften. One well-known veteran who had worked the Yukon for decades and who was not known for handing out compliments to competitors looked at the nugget samples from the cleanup and stated plainly that he had never encountered concentration like that in placer gold work before. That statement, coming from that particular source, landed with significant weight across the community. The deeper investigation that followed the initial cleanup produced findings that only complicated the picture further. Advanced underground mapping revealed that the original anomaly was not an isolated pocket. The cavity system surrounding the deposit appeared to extend to greater depths, with scan data suggesting connected chambers existing at nearly 220 feet below the surface. The imaging showed patterns that geological experts described as unusual, formations that looked less like random natural cavities and more like a structured deep channel system that gold-bearing material had been accumulating within over an extended geological timeframe. One expert reviewing the three-dimensional mapping data said plainly that if the structure continued downward as the readings suggested, the deposit could not be classified as a standard placer formation. It would represent something rare and scientifically significant. That possibility came with serious complications. A connected underground chamber system at those depths carries collapse risk that standard placer mining operations are never designed to manage. As the drilling pushed deeper in the weeks following the initial cleanup, pressure readings in the war room began behaving erratically. Warning indicators appeared more frequently. Engineers monitoring the live underground data began flagging zones where the cavity walls showed signs of movement. The probability estimates for partial collapse in the lower sections climbed steadily, reaching figures that made some of the more experienced engineers genuinely uncomfortable. Then one night the most serious incident of the operation occurred. During a deep drilling run, sensors positioned around the primary excavation zone detected heavy underground vibrations that initially read as machine-generated pressure. Within minutes it became clear they were not. The cavity walls were moving. Emergency response was immediate. Pumps were activated as groundwater began flooding into the lower excavation zone with unexpected speed. Crew members moved back from the danger area while engineers worked to stabilize the pressure differential. The situation was controlled, but it required hours of work and left visible damage to sections of the lower drilling operation. For the first time, the danger that the old shutdown records had hinted at was no longer theoretical. It was standing right in front of the crew in the form of mud and shifting rock, and the sound of ground that was making clear it did not particularly want to be disturbed. Rick stood at the edge of the excavation pit that night and said nothing for a long time. The operation had now confirmed a discovery of extraordinary potential. The initial numbers were remarkable. The deeper scan data suggested the total value underground could exceed the initial $190 million estimate if the lower chamber system proved to be as gold-rich as the surface readings implied. Some analysts who had been following the story began raising the possibility that the actual recoverable value, if the entire deep system was successfully accessed and processed, could ultimately reach into the billions. That was speculative, but it was not obviously wrong speculation, and that distinction mattered enormously. At the same time, the ground was actively demonstrating why the original mining operation had walked away. The unstable cavities, the water pressure, the collapsing sections, none of it was insurmountable with modern equipment and engineering expertise, but all of it was genuinely dangerous and expensive to manage. Every foot of additional depth brought more gold into range and also brought the operation closer to conditions that could cause a catastrophic failure if the wrong section was breached at the wrong moment. What Rick Ness had found in that forgotten corner of the Yukon was not simply a gold deposit. It was a test. A question posed by the Earth itself about how much risk was acceptable in pursuit of something genuinely extraordinary. The old miners of 4 decades ago had looked at that same question and decided the answer was not yet, or perhaps never. They had sealed their records, shut down their equipment, and walked away from whatever they had glimpsed underground, leaving it for someone else to find someday or for no one to find at all. Rick Ness had found it, and now, with his entire reputation and financial future committed to seeing it through, he stood at the threshold of either the greatest comeback story in Yukon gold rush history or one of its most dramatic cautionary tales. The deeper drilling phase was approved. New equipment was brought in to handle the conditions the lower chambers presented. The crew, shaken but not broken by the close call with the flooding incident, prepared for the